So as you know, we're talking about objections today, and I'm going to hopefully provide a really different spin on objections that at any point you've heard in your career. I take a lot of pride in really being a different kind of trainer and taking a different approach than template or generic based approaches. So I'm excited to share this with you today. And we have 30 minutes, and we won't cover everything, but we'll certainly get your wheels turning and hopefully some new awarenesses that you can walk away and immediately apply today. The way I look at objections being different is whenever you hear in sales about overcoming objections, it's about overcoming them as opposed to avoiding or preventing them. And what I think is really important about that is I don't even want to hear any objections. And I know that might seem pie in the sky to a lot of you listening today, but I don't think it is. I think if you handle the sales process the right way, you ask enough questions along the way, and you proactively address common concerns a lot of people have about your service or product, you can avoid and prevent them as opposed to having to reactively deal with them. Now, what you see on the screen right now related to sales emotional intelligence, this is a term that is not really common for sales, and it's the way I'm really trying to brand and differentiate my company. Emotional intelligence is, I'm only going to cover it for about 30 seconds to a minute today due to time, but what it basically is, it's having a self-awareness around how people are reacting to you, perceiving you, thinking about you, how you see yourself. It involves self-control. And when you get irritated or frustrated, or prospects or customers react to you in a certain way, you stay focused on the matter at hand and you don't let it get to you. And it involves motivation and empathy. So it's really such a critical factor to the success of sales, and more people are starting to be alerted to the importance of emotional intelligence, but it's something that I think is really critical. You can go slide, Mark. So just real quick today, as I said, really looking for you guys to stimulate some new awarenesses. And look, the one last point I want to make today is please do yourselves a favor. It's only 30 minutes. Shut off your phones, close down your emails, and remove all distractions so you can really be present and take all this in. Okay, Mark. All right, so the agenda. So the agenda today is we're going to see how you can address primary objections and, again, avoid and prevent them, the root causes of why objections happen, how you can deal with them in a conversation, non-adversarial way, and how you can improve your current responses. Now, I've got something interesting for you all to start with today, and I want you to think about this for a moment. I'm going to use life insurance as an example. And I'm sure some of you on this call are selling life insurance or some kind of insurance, but it's a perfect example. So think about some of the common objections to life insurance. And here's some examples, because I've worked with a lot of individuals and organizations selling insurance. So, doesn't benefit me when I'm dead. My parents didn't have it, so why do I need it? My kids are at a stage in their life where they don't need it. They're pretty successful on their own. I have enough money. I don't need life insurance. I want to control my own money. It's not as good of an investment. I mean, the list goes on and on. But there's at least a half dozen common objections to people who sell insurance, and specifically life insurance. Now, if you're one of those people listening to the call who are selling this product, you know that. So if you know the 5 to 10 most common objections to your service or product, and you don't have a comfortable way to address those objections proactively, you've already lost. Because one of the points I want to make today is when you get in a situation, you've got to make a decision when you're selling. And the decision is, do you cross your fingers and hope that the person doesn't bring it up, that the person isn't thinking it, or the person, when they talk to other decision makers or other influences that they'll discuss making a decision with, that they won't think it? And if you're crossing your fingers hoping that no one brings it up or thinks about it, you're already in a difficult spot. So one of the big things I'm trying to impress upon you in this webinar today is addressing the elephant in the room, being proactive with common objections. So you're at the advantage, because when you bring up a potential objection, you're now controlling the talk track and you can frame it however you want. When someone brings it up to you, you don't necessarily see it coming. You're not ready for it. And if you don't have answers, like I just said, for the most common objections, you could lose the sale just in that one moment during the process. Okay, Mark, go ahead. So the question is, what are your biggest communication challenges, right? Is it anticipating objections? Is it overcoming objections? Is it, like what I was just talking about, preventing them, cutting them off before they happen? Or is it avoiding them, like I was just speaking about? So think about that, because when I reach out to you after the webinar today, if you have a specific concern, I'm happy to help you with it. And at the very end of the webinar today, I will give you two answers to two ways to handle two of the most common objections you hear. Okay, Mark. So let's talk about a need versus a want. Okay, so here's what I'm saying here. My biggest objection to the concept of an objection is when you get an objection at the end of a sales presentation or in a follow-up email or phone call after you've sent a proposal. 9 times out of 10, in my mind, you've missed something. Because if they're bringing something up that late in the game, you probably should have addressed it earlier. So there's certain categories of understanding what you should cover and what you may have missed. But the biggest one of all is need versus want. Now, what I'm trying to say there is, I once had a mentor tell me, he would ask a question to a prospect. He would say, regarding the importance of this issue, if you had a stack of papers on your desk really high, where would this issue be on the stack of papers? In the top, in the middle, or on the bottom? And whether you like that question or not, that was his way of diagnosing whether this was a need or a want. We know people really like to do due diligence. They like to know what the solutions are and what the latest and greatest is. But if you don't diagnose need versus want very early in the sales process, you're going to find objections at the end, such as, I need some more time, or this isn't exactly what I hoped it would be. And if you would have diagnosed and properly assessed earlier in the process, you wouldn't run into this. So what the message here is there's 3 or 4 things I want you to really make sure you understand in the beginning, right? Why are you here? What created the sense of urgency where this was a need and not just a want? What are your fears? Now, take a step back and think about that for a second. What are your fears? Because in a few moments, we're going to cover that. But everybody has fears. And so if you can't get on top of why the person would be worried about moving forward with you, before you even get into the product, there's baggage and there's fears. You need to know that. Who is involved in the decision-making process? I think most of us that's drilled into us, even though sometimes we forget to ask or are not assertive enough to ask. And what other options are they considering? So really understanding that urgency level from the get-go of need and want is critical. Okay, Mark. All right, so let's address the elephant in the room, right? What are the things that they're going to ask, or they're probably thinking about your product, your industry, your service that you want to address? Now, think of the influences human beings have when they make decisions, right? So when we talk about decision makers, we often think of selling into, if it's a B2B selling into a company situation, we'll think of the other decision makers of the company. A lot of you are selling to B2C individuals. It could be their significant other. It could be a family member, so on and so forth. But you know where else people are influenced and have other decision makers? Their colleagues, their friends, Google, and here's a big one, past experiences that they don't want to repeat. So I want you to change the mindset you have about how you reflect on other decision makers, because it's really broad. Now, let me give you an example, a very quick example of what I was alluding to earlier about crossing your fingers and hoping people don't bring up objections. I work with one of the largest cruise lines in the world, and I work with their sales teams across US and Canada. And what you might expect is they cruise in the winter. And this is not like the Love Boat kind of cruise where these are week-long cruises. These are event cruises, dinner cruises, weddings, birthday celebrations, things like that. So think about how likely you would be to take a cruise in December or January. Pretty unlikely, right? So when they get on the phone with people during the winter months, they don't want to bring up weather because they're hoping, they feel like, well, we're lucky enough we get people on the phone. I don't want to bring up the risk of weather. And so the point I make to them is people are thinking it. Whether they bring it up, if you don't address why they can feel better about the weather and how you have temperature controlled decks and all the different accommodations you make around weather, you've lost. Because again, when someone gets off the phone with you or gets done a meeting with you, think about this. Think about this situation. Someone's talking to you, you've had the greatest interaction, they think your product or service is the greatest thing since sliced bread. You feel like you got the sale, you're done. They just need to go back and process what you've heard and whatever, and then they come back 3 days later and they said, yeah, you know what? I don't think we can move forward because, a couple of people in our discussion had concerns about the weather. And that whole Debbie Downer moment happened so bad. And what I'm trying to say is that if you proactively address an objection, even if it doesn't come up, especially when you know there's other decision makers in the room, you can guide them and teach them how to frame how weather isn't a problem if and when it is brought up. And this is why one of the most critical ways I encourage people to overcome objections is the email that you send after you have a sales presentation. Whether it's the proposal email or the follow-up email, I have a really successful and specific process that I encourage people to use in that follow-up email. And the idea is that email is going to form as a script for your contact person to address concerns of other decision makers. So really think about that. Think about how you have an opportunity to prepare a person to address other people's objections. Okay, Mark. Now I'm going to tell you, I worked very hard to find a way to incorporate these two guys into this presentation because let me tell you, I love these guys. And I know I mentioned the Love Boat. I'm really dating myself now with the Love Boat and Muppets, but I got to tell you, what I love about these guys is it really fits what I want to talk about now, and that is sarcasm and skepticism. And for those of you who remember these guys, they stood up in the balcony after each act and would rag on it and make fun of it and so on and so forth. And so this is the mentality that so many people start in interaction with: skepticism, sarcasm, doubt, and frustration, either because of what they've been told, either because of what their past experiences and baggage are. One way or another, this is how it starts. So get these guys in your head thinking, yeah, this is what I'm up against. Okay, Mark. So the question is, this is the list. And I want you to take 30 seconds just to review it for a minute, right? This is the list of fears. This is the list of things that a decision maker starts with: fear, uncertainty, doubt, before you've even opened your mouth. These are the things that are going in their head. And if you remember in the beginning of the presentation, when I was talking about the things that might prevent someone from buying life insurance, these are the things that prevent people from buying, period. So if you're looking at these full 5 bullets and saying to yourself, yeah, these are legit, these could be a problem, how do you address this? Because again, another example, someone gets to the end of the process, they love your service or product, they love you, they think you're the greatest thing, and they come back and they say, I just don't think we can move forward. And you're like, why not? And they said, well, I don't know, I went down this road before, it didn't work out, and I'm just not ready to go down that road again. Well, so now that you know that, Now you're playing catch up, and now you're coming from behind, and it's hard to come back because you know what's happened at that point? So many people have taken days or weeks to come to that conclusion and process that decision. And now you have to unravel and undo that entire thought process that they came up with. So these 5 things, I address these. I'll ask, hey, what are some concerns? I mean, have you tried this in the past? Have you had any bad experiences? You know, what is your relationship like with previous vendors or salespeople? Where are you getting your sources of information? A lot of people use Google for information and they really don't do proper due diligence. And the first thing they Google, they latch onto, and that becomes their Bible. So look, fears, you've got to help people overcome the fears. You know, money is a fear. There's no question. Money is a fear, but these are also legitimate fears and why people don't like to stick their neck out and make a decision. Okay. So let's go to the next slide, Mark. So when we talk about core values, what I want you to think about with core values are, we're talking about preventing objections. We're talking about changing perceptions. So when I talk about core values, it might be odd to you in the early stages of a presentation to talk about core values because it's not something people typically do. But I often will say something like this. I'm going to model something for you all, and you could use some of it, all of it, whatever's authentic to you. But this is the way I'll often start a presentation. I'll say, listen, before we get into this today, let me share some of my core values and how I like to do business with people, just to confirm that it connects with who you are and what you're looking for. One of them is, I don't like sales. I don't like people who are aggressive, who are pushy, who have an agenda. I don't like that. So I don't like when people do that to me, so I won't do that to you. Number 2, I don't waste people's time because I really value my own time. So I will be very respectful of the time and willingness you're giving me to listen to how I can help you and how we can work together today. Number 3, I want the truth. You know, if at any point during this process, you don't feel comfortable that this is the right solution for you, let me know. Because I don't want to be strung along. I don't want you to be scared to tell me no. And I'd rather know the truth. And 4th, I recognize fears around making decisions around money. Because no one wants to, we work so hard for our money. No one wants to make a wrong decision. No one wants to look bad. No one wants to be that person. So these are things that I really take to heart when I form relationships with people. And so I start the whole interaction in basically a 1-minute monologue, like I just did, addressing 4 things that I think are some of the most common things that prospects are worried about in dealing with salespeople. And what's interesting is one of those 4 things that I get pushback on, not from a prospect, but from other salespeople and sales leaders, is the one where I want you to tell me the truth and I want you to tell me if you really don't think this is the right solution. And it's absurd, frankly, because people, in the same way, someone might say, well, I don't want to ask if they're looking at other solutions because maybe they won't think maybe they weren't thinking about looking at other solutions. I don't want to tell them they can say no because maybe they wouldn't think they could say no if I didn't bring it up. It's BS. People aren't stupid. And what I'm trying to impress upon you in this webinar today is you've got to make a decision. You've got to trust yourself. You've got to trust your product and service. And you've got to think higher of people. And for every one person that by telling them that you want the truth and you want them to feel comfortable saying no if it's not a fit, for every one person that allegedly informs that they can say no earlier in the process, it'll form a trust level with 10 other people. And isn't that what we're trying to do, is form a trust? Think about a networking event, everybody. Think about one of the things you're trying to do at a networking event. You're trying to find ways to connect with other human beings. This is my approach to connecting with other human beings, trying to ascertain what their fears are, what their assumptions are, what they're already thinking before I start talking. Because if I don't understand what makes another person tick, then I could be missing a primary detail and end up dealing with an objection later on in the sales process that easily could have been vetted out and ruins the deal. Okay, Mark, go ahead. All right, so let's talk about this. Every sale has 8 basic obstacles. And I'm just going to touch upon a few of these. You can all read, but I'm just going to touch upon a few of these, just respectful of time, just to make a couple of points. We've talked about number 4, the no urgency exploratory tire kickers. We talk about 8, competition. The thing about competition is this. Competition is there. And as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, it's not just about the competition of the other solutions they're looking at. You know what your competition is? It could be the incumbent provider. It could be other people in the decision-making process have preferences that you don't even know about. So don't just think about competition where someone's looking at 3 options. Think of it a lot deeper, because one of the things you really want to do with obstacles is when you determine there are other decision makers in the process, you have to ask questions about those other decision makers. You know, are they partial to anybody? What are their fears? What are their biggest priorities in the decision-making process? You need to understand that. So think of competition in a much broader sense. Affordability. Just want to make one other quick point about affordability. Listen, when you ask people, depending on what you're selling, if you ask people what their budget is, if you're lucky enough for them to feel comfortable giving you a number, the thing you have to understand is most people don't have a real process for developing a budget. Here's the example I'm going to give you. If I go into Best Buy and I need to buy a TV and the salesperson says to me, how much do you want to spend? Let's say I said $750, okay? So the salesperson is going to make 2 choices at that point. They've got to sell to that $750 budget, or they can try to upsell and see if they can prove the worth and value of me spending a little more in my budget. And a lot of salespeople get so tunnel visioned on when they hear a specific number that they have to stick to. So when I get the obstacle of affordability or budget, what I will say back is, let me just make sure, is $750 absolute cap to what you want to spend? Or if I could show you some value and benefits to spending a bit more, would you be open to it? And I got to tell you, 75% of the time, the person will say, no, I'd be open to spending more money if you could show the value. So these obstacles, again, it's really daunting. You know, when I was putting together this PowerPoint, I thought to myself, I hope people don't walk away and go, oh my God, there's like 100 more things we got to worry about when we're talking in sales. It's not there's 100 more things. It's just about understanding the barriers that you can get ahead of and that you don't have to wait till they pop up at the end of the sales process. Okay, Mark. Now, we've got objection types, right? And this is really important, right? Because objections aren't always legitimate. And this is why sometimes when we get an objection, there's a tendency to go in defend and justify mode, which is a big mistake until you've confirmed what kind of objection it is. Now, a valid objection could be a capability you don't have. And if there's a capability you don't have, part of what you're supposed to be doing instead of defending and justifying and trying to overcome it is you're trying to ask why it's so important in the first place. And if think about a typical sales interaction, if you've been doing an effective job asking questions and listening, and you're all the way through the process, and at the end, someone comes up with an objection you don't have, but all along, they've loved everything you've said. So how important is this in the grand scheme of things? So don't instinctively defend and justify, get to the root of why this is important and how it compares to the other things they loved about your product. The second one is a misunderstanding. Now, a misunderstanding comes from bad information. Google, people who have used similar products, not necessarily your own, or have done similar services. They share their experiences. They get your prospect nervous and fearful, or Google gets your prospect nervous and fearful. And now you've got bad information. So again, don't defend and justify. Understand where the information comes from, whether it's actual legitimate information, and then you might find out it isn't an objection at all, because once you walk them off the ledge and have them come to the conclusion on their own that that's legitimate, there's no more objection. And the third one is a misinterpretation. And that comes from, they just, whether it was your website or marketing materials or something, they just misinterpreted that. The cruise line I was talking about before, what comes up with them is they will put baseline pricing on the website, but that pricing doesn't include taxes and fees and gratuity. It also doesn't include, it's based on a per person charge. So until the cruise line would know the amount of people cruising, they could never give an exact price. But yet someone calls up and says, here's the objection. Well, your pricing is different than what's on the website. So that was just a misinterpretation. And then I want you to look at that little asterisk, that bogey, which is a phony objection that's used to negotiate a discount. So that's why the objection, the first objection I talked about, which is the capability you don't have, that could be a bogey. That could be something they're just bringing up as a tool for negotiation. So it's really important that your instinctive reaction to an objection is to seek clarity, get to the root and understand why this is so important to them, and perhaps allow them to draw conclusions on their own of why it isn't such a big deal relative to the big picture in the grand scheme of things. Okay, Mark. Okay, so here are I've created this new expression. I call them FEFs, frequently expressed fears. And here is 6 of the most commonly expressed fears about products and services. Service means customer service in the bullet in this case. So what I want you to see on this slide is, look at my 3 ways to handle a frequently expressed fear. One is the rookie method, where you hear an objection and you immediately go to defending and justifying and starting to sell why your product's better. Don't do that. The pro version is someone expresses a concern about one of those bullets, and you share a client story about someone who had that same concern and how you rectified it and how you solved that problem and why it didn't end up being a concern at all. And by the way, that's why storytelling is such an immensely important aspect of sales, because if you start selling, defending, and justifying, then it's coming from your perspective. If it's from a client's perspective and a client experience, it doesn't sound like it's from you. It sounds like you're relating a client experience. And then there's the all-star method, which I've been speaking to, which is ask questions, identify details and root cause of where this concern fits in the grand scheme of things. Okay, Mark. Okay, so we're almost at time, so I'm just going to cover a couple of fast things here at the end. Being accountable. So one thing that we're not going to get deep into today, but I do want you to be thinking about when you get off this presentation today is, a lot of salespeople, once they have a phone or in-person interaction during the follow-up, they'll do an email to see if they're going to move forward instead of a phone call. And I understand it's much faster and more efficient, but as a salesperson, I'm asking you every time you're seeking a decision from somebody to tell yourself and be honest, am I emailing because it's the right way to go, or am I emailing because I'm scared they're going to say no or reject me and I don't want to hear it? And that's where the sales emotional intelligence comes in. You have to be aware. It's a lot easier to tell someone no in writing than it is face-to-face. And by the way, when you do it in writing in an email, you lose the opportunity to ask follow-up questions and really discover if you can still salvage that sale. An email is an easy way out for someone to reject you and object to you. So be honest with yourself. Why am I emailing for this decision instead of calling for the decision? Okay, next, Mark. Best practices. I'm going to go through this rapid fire. Don't assume price is the only factor if they tell you that. People will say, what's our most important thing in the deal? Price. Again, not always the most important thing. It's just one of people's biggest fears, which is why it comes to mind first. Last right of refusal. If you are dealing in a situation where there are multiple other companies being evaluated and considered for your service, ask for the last right of refusal. Say, listen, you're going to find out other things after you talk to these companies. Can we have last right of refusal to match your price or to discuss anything new you found out? Number 3, nagging rights. Stay in control of the timeline. Once you finish a presentation and you discuss next steps, if you haven't controlled the timeline, you're going to be in a situation where you're going to be sitting at your desk worrying if it's too soon to call or am I calling too often. Number 4, magic wand. If you're stumped and you don't know an open-ended question to ask the magic wand question, which is to say, if there was one thing that would be the most important, if I had a magic wand and I could fix one problem you have right now, what would that problem be? Number 5, what we've talked about during the whole presentation today, address the elephant in the room. Don't hide, proactive. And number 6, be curious. Ask questions to determine why that particular objection means so much. Go ahead, Mark. So I will address, if you want to stay on when we're finished, if Mark's okay, I'll take 5 more minutes when we're done this webinar today to give you the solutions to 3 common objections. Go ahead, Mark. So quick note, here's some upcoming events. Tomorrow, there's a webinar done by one of my colleagues, Joe Lyman, on clearly, effectively, and critical thinking. And as every Thursday, we have a radio show. This week, by the way, our podcast, which you can get on Apple and Spotify as well, is on triggers, sales triggers, things that derail salespeople during the process, frustrations, and things that derail prospects during the process. Okay, Mark. Listen, NAFA and Mindset Go have put in a lot of time to this, and we would really appreciate on the NAFA social media and on Mindset Go social media, share your experiences. We're so thrilled. We're getting, an average of about 50 people on these webinars. And so we're so thrilled we're helping so many people. And so please share your experiences if you were happy. And if you're not, don't say anything at all. Just kidding. Not really. Next one, Mark. Okay, and yeah, you can skip that, Mark, and let's just go right back to the questions and tell me a little bit about, if you have any questions, you can send them to me and email me after the fact. But if you're willing to hang on, I'm going to cover these 3 objections as I told you I would. Okay, so one of the objections we hear is someone who's happy with their current provider. That's how we've always done it. We'll stick with where we're at, why we're happy, so on and so forth. So if someone says that, my instinctive reaction is to say, now remember, before I say this, most prospects are thinking when they say that to you, that they're going to get rid of you, because that's enough for you to go, oh, okay, I'm all set then. Thanks. Nice talking to you. But you're not going to be gotten rid of that easy. So I start with a very positive reaction because that's not what they're expecting. I say, well, that's fantastic. I say, I look at so many companies who struggle to find really good vendors. So congrats, that's awesome. What is it that made you choose that company initially? Or what is it that, what's their best quality? And then I'll come in with the magic wand question of, and as great as they are, if you could change something about them, what would it be? And then if you can get them, after being really positive and complimentary about them and their current provider, if you can get them to respond to that magic wand question and open the door for a discussion about why you're better, or that would be great. Bye, Joe. Thanks for coming. All right, so that's 1. 2. Multiple or incorrect decision makers. So the person says, oh, I need to run this by my boss or I need to run this by my wife or husband and I'll get back to you. So again, if you get that objection, it is essential that, number one, if you get that objection, the one quick takeaway you should have from that is you should never get that objection at the end, because you should have already known that. So if you ever get that objection, that means you're not asking the right questions about the decision makers involved in the first place. That's number one. Number two, you've got to prepare them for what they're up against. People retain, the statistic is, after 10 minutes, people retain 10% of the information they've learned. So the likelihood that that person who is so engaged in believing in you will take that same information to other decision makers is slim and none. So you've got to script it for them in an email, how to get them ready for the other decision makers. Let's see. Okay, and last but not least, my personal favorite, could you just send me something? Love this objection. You're trying to talk to someone, get time with them, get an appointment. They say, hey, just send me something. So here's the thing. What I say to that is, when someone says, can I say, absolutely, I'd be happy to. Could you let me know specifically what you want me to focus on about my product or service when I send it to you? And right then and there, by pushing back and asking that question, you'll get crickets and you'll get a pause, because people won't be expecting that. Again, can you just send me something? They'll think that can just get rid of you. And then you're going to find out what is important to them. So that's a different version of the magic wand. And then let's say they say, well, I'd like you to highlight blank and blank. And then you can say, and if you like what you see, and if it adds value, what would happen? So now I'd ask some follow-up qualifying questions. So what will happen? And then you might learn about the decision-making process. And then you might learn about the level of urgency this is for them overall. But part of objections, especially in the early stages, is not being assertive and not being pushed around, and understanding a couple of very simple questions you can ask to get through those objections. So that's going to be it for today, everybody. I really appreciate your time. I know Mark will send out a recording of this. I'll send out some resources to everybody from this webinar today, and otherwise, we'll look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks again.